Welcome to This Explainer. Look, today we're doing something really important. We're taking a hard, data-driven look at Afghanistan's climate future. We're cutting through all the noise and just looking straight at the hard science. We're pulling this directly from a joint report by the UN Environment Program and Afghanistan's National Environmental Protection Agency. So there's no speculation here, just objective data, historical facts, and some pretty intense high-resolution projections that honestly, anyone involved in policy, funding, or just global citizenship really needs to wrap their head around. Right, so let's jump in and let's ground ourselves in the actual physical reality of Afghanistan first. It is an incredibly diverse environment, defined by extreme topography and totally unique microclimates. It's stunning, right? But here's the thing. That natural beauty is also deeply, deeply vulnerable. The communities living in these valleys rely entirely on the natural rhythms of this specific landscape. And as the data is going to show us, those rhythms are already being aggressively thrown off balance. So, to break this all down today, we're going to hit four main areas. First, the context of Afghanistan's changing climate. Second, future climate projections. Third, the real-world threats to agriculture and ecosystems. And finally, the urgent need for adaptation.
All right, part one, context Afghanistan's changing climate.
You know, when we talk about climate change in Afghanistan, we aren't talking about some distant theoretical future. It's a measurable, historical reality right now. If we look at the regional trends, the country as a whole has already warmed by over 1.8 degrees Celsius since the mid-20th century. But if you focus on the south, there's a massive 2.4 degrees Celsius spike. This proves the country isn't just warming, it's warming at an accelerated and really uneven pace. Moving on to part two, future climate projections. So to figure out what happens next, we have to look at the latest generation of UN climate models. But before we do that, let's just quickly define a key term you'll hear, RCP, or Representative Concentration Pathways. Basically, these are standardized frameworks used by the IPCC. They aren't just blind guesses. They evaluate different potential futures based on real-world socio-economic factors, things like population growth and, crucially, global greenhouse gas emission levels. It is absolutely crucial to understand the stark contrast between the two main pathways we're looking at. On one hand, we have the optimistic scenario, RCP 4.5. This assumes a world where we actually manage to limit and stabilize global emissions. But on the other hand, we have the pessimistic scenario, RCP 8.5. This is essentially the business as usual, high-end scenario driven by completely unchecked emissions and unchecked population growth. Keep both of these very different futures in mind as we look at the actual numbers. Now, let's break down those projected temperature increases. Even in that optimistic scenario where we limit emissions globally, Afghanistan is still projected to warm by 1.4 degrees by 2050, and it stabilizes around 2.6 degrees by 2100. That optimistic model all by itself is a massive shift that outpaces the global average. But man, look at the pessimistic scenario. The way these numbers diverge as we move through the 21st century is literally terrifying. 2 degrees by 2050, and by 2100, well, it just goes off the charts. A staggering 6.3 degrees Celsius. I really want you to let that number sink in. That is the projected average warming by the end of this century if global greenhouse gases are just left unchecked. In planetary science terms, a 6.3 degree increase isn't just a heat wave, it's a total, radical transformation of the entire environment. And the data makes it incredibly clear that this warming won't be spread out evenly either. The regional disparities are huge. Critical high-altitude areas, specifically the Central Highlands and the Hindu Kush, especially the Wakhan corridor, they're projected to take the absolute worst of it. In these specific areas, the models are showing temperature spikes reaching up to 3 degrees Celsius in just the near future. The near future. But, heat is only half the story. The other half is water. When we look at the projected shifts in precipitation across these scenarios, it's pretty concerning. While the total yearly rainfall might be a bit unpredictable, the models predict distinct drop-offs during the most critical seasons. And that puts an immense, immediate stress on regional water systems and snowpack in a country that relies completely on natural water storage.
Okay, part three, threats to agriculture and ecosystems.
So what do all these scientific models actually mean for survival on the ground? Well, consider this, a 30 to 40% drop. That is the estimated historical decrease in crucial spring precipitation for areas in the East, North, and Central Highlands. Just think about that, losing up to 40% of your water during the single most important time for rain-fed agriculture. And looking ahead, the models project another 20% drop in those regions by 2100. For a nation so incredibly dependent on rain-fed farming, losing those spring rains is a catastrophic threat to basic food security.
If global emissions keep following that pessimistic, business-as-usual path, the cascading risks laid out in the UN report are, well, they're essentially apocalyptic. The data straight up says that kind of warming would likely cause a complete transformation of the environment. Ecosystems simply cannot adapt to a 6-degree spike in under 100 years. It means we'd likely see the extinction of endemic species. Current agricultural systems would just fail, which cascades into severe economic decay and widespread, totally unpredictable crises for public health and food security.
Which brings us to part 4, the urgent need for adaptation. Okay, shifting gears from the harshness of those projections, we need to talk about solutions. What do these numbers actually demand from policymakers and international donors? The report highlights a really critical concept here. Afghanistan is already operating with a massive adaptation deficit. Basically, their current infrastructure isn't even equipped to handle today's climate variability, let alone tomorrow's. Because of that deficit, just crossing our fingers for an optimistic global emissions scenario is not a real strategy. Even a 2.6-degree increase brings massive, complex challenges that require immediate, laser-focused investment and resilience building across literally every sector. And this brings us to a definitive conclusion, straight from the UN Environment Program and NEPA report, and it serves as a clear mandate for action. The signals are alarming. The science leaves zero room for ambiguity. Survival here requires a two-pronged approach: a massive, urgent upgrade to domestic adaptation measures, right alongside a rigorous, non-negotiable global effort to slash greenhouse gas emissions. So the data has been laid bare. It maps a trajectory from an already vulnerable baseline straight toward a potential 6-degree reality. I want to leave you with this final thought to challenge our global readiness. With the science signaling a clear, present, and totally measurable climate emergency, will the international community and policymakers step up and invest in Afghanistan's adaptation and resilience today? Or are we going to wait until that devastating 6.3-degree threshold becomes a reality we simply can't escape? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.